Doctors/surgeons/nurses of Reddit, what's the worst thing you experienced while at work? Taking care of a fall patient that broke her pelvis. She just found out her husband had cancer and she wouldn't be there for him. She was crying, telling me that he was there for every appointment and treatment when she had cancer, and now he'd have to go through it alone. When I was a CNA, I got into a situation where I didn't have gloves on and got poop on my hand. I scrubbed like everything after and moved on with my night. A while later I absent-mindedly chewed my fingernail and tasted, you guessed it, poop. I vomited and dry heaved. Ran to the bathroom and scrubbed my mouth out with soap. It took a while for that taste to go away. Ah, the good old CNA days. I remember giving this old man a shower that needed assistance and a shower chair. While he was sitting down, I kneeled down to wash under his legs and was behind the back of the chair. He proceeded to have the loudest, most explosive diarrhea/fart I've ever witnessed. Needless to say, some of it ended up in my face. Watching another nurse pulling a fall mat away from a patient's floor next to her bed. When asked why, she said in front of the patient, she about to die anyway. Her mouth was stuck open because she was so emaciated, but she could still cry. Her frozen face somehow allowed her to still cry after she heard that, and she did for a long time. I sat there with her. The patient was in custody of the state, a mental hospital, and they chose to withhold food and water. A type of forced DNR. She was around 90-something. We were forced to watch her slowly starve to death. I quit right after that. Had to tell a guy he had killed his mother whilst he was high on methamphetamine. Former paramedic, long story short, got a call for what turned out to be a very dead, decomposing man who had passed alone in his apartment. His body was filled with gas, fairly common to be honest. As I'm standing by the body calling the hospital to give them a heads up about what's about to come their way and get approval to move, new EMT decides to poke gas-filled body. It explodes. He loses a hand and a trillion vaporized bits of dead old man cover me, got in my open mouth, under my clothes, etc. Taste was awful. After hundreds of showers I could still smell corpse on me. My SO at the time said every time she nuzzled me or got close to my hair, she could smell it too. It was like that for about a week. Still makes me gag to think about, and that kid's life was pretty much permanently changed. Wait, the new EMT lost a hand in a body explosion? Yup. A lot of gas can accumulate in dead bodies, and if it gets trapped, it can be almost like a bomb. New guy was kneeling next to the body. I think this was his first serious call because he had that kind of glazed over, I'm in shock, look in his eyes, and he put his hand on the guy's stomach. It sank down into this bloated, gas-filled sack until said sack just broke. My crew chief said it would be like sinking your fist into a box of firecrackers. Honestly, not sure how he came up with that analogy and didn't really work in my mind. But yeah. Dead body exploded, got gunk everywhere and took off the EMT's hand. Longest incident report I have ever filed. I frequently experience terminally ill patients dying in excruciating pain with no euthanasia laws to support them, and people like my mother, who was, also an experienced ERRN, and who also asked for similar assistance when she was dying. Vet nurse here. Had a staffy come in one night whose labor had stopped. We gave her the drug she needed and the labor started back up. Sadly, it had stalled for so long that the next 3 pups up the line were dead. Their placental sacs were already green and necrotic looking. We managed to save the last 2. Now, we let mom have a normal labor with normal behaviors, so this meant that she ate those 3 necrotic placental sacs. Naturally, mom then threw this up but onto her 2 surviving pups. It was a lot in a small round bed and I was afraid the pups would aspirate, so I quickly stuck my hands into the mess and picked them up. But this also lifted the smell straight up and into my very soul. In the very next heartbeat I threw up on mum. It's the only time my job has made me sick and was one of the worst nights at work ever. I was sitting here horrified at the thought of all that as well and then went back and read, vet nurse, and it all made sense. This case in my internship made me give up on specializing in pediatrics. Young boy got brought in for rheumatic heart disease, already in heart failure. Apparently, this all started from a minor skin infection and went all the way up into his heart valves. We met him already in the PICU. He was still conscious and able to talk, And so for his first day we built a sort of rapport. The next morning, before my friends and I clocked out, he wasn't looking so great, so the resident in charge called in the general surgery team to perform a cut down to expose his veins for access. I had to hold down the poor kid during the procedure, since local anesthesia could only do so much. He was screaming, so I told him, "Just hold on, we'll get through this." He nodded and said okay. That was the last conversation we had. When I came in for my next shift he was already intubated. The only parent with him was his father since his mother was employed overseas. Now for many of these cases, a letter to the employer is needed to explain why so and so must go home in this case of family emergency. I volunteered to draft the letter and send it out so we could get this lady on a flight soon and have her come home for her son. As soon as I put the last period on that letter, I was typing in the nurse's station. The kid coded just a few feet away. We couldn't bring him back. The next worst part of course was telling his father what had just happened and asking if he wanted us to stop the resuscitation. That conversation will stay with me. No one should have to bury a child due to something so preventable. Not a nurse but a tech working on becoming a nurse. I've got a few stories. The saddest one was a woman who had an aggressive but treatable cancer. She was riddled with guilt from all the debt her family was incurring, and broke down when she told me she wished she would just die soon so that the debt would stop accumulating. That one hurt to hear. And then the grossest thing I've had. In addition to the guy that was throwing poo at me every time I stepped in the room, I had a patient that was over 500 pounds. I had been told that she had a sacral wound, and that during the night I would need to prep her for surgery in the morning. So the night is going on, everyone is crapping themselves repeatedly and I'm trying to keep up. Then I go to get this woman's bed prepped for the surgeon. I step in the room and this lady tells me that she's had a bowel movement. I did not need her to tell me. It looked like she was sitting in a tub of old, congealed pudding. It leaked down the sides of the bed and had spilled out onto the floor. At this point I backed out of the room and went to get some backup on this situation. So, there's another tech and 4 nurses, for a total of 6 of us that were going to tackle this. Each of us had at least 3 contact gowns on, and we put on 2 masks with a layer of alcohol swabs and Vapo Rub in between them. Basically, everything short of going in with full hazmat gear, but honestly, I wouldn't have turned down a nice Tyvek suit. So we step into the room and all get to cleaning the rancid swamp out of the room. And I mean cleaning it off of things that should never have had poo on them. So it's finally cleaned up to the point that we can actually approach the bed and get to work on the patient. We all position ourselves properly to roll her to the side, and it takes all of us to roll her. I happen to be on the butt-facing side for this, pushing her up. As we get her on her side, I see some gauze packed into her butt wound. Not unusual, but I knew it would be pretty gross. Problem was that the gauze had become one with the fecal material at this point, and so I basically had to reach in and start unpacking it with my hands. And it just kept going deeper. I was prepared for a nasty wound. I was not prepared to be elbow deep in this woman's butt, and as I unpacked it the smell of rot and feces began to hit, even through our defenses. One of the nurses stepped out and threw up into one of the vomit bags. So here I am, elbow deep inside a woman, cleaning the remnants of Lake Michigan off of her literal tailbone. And apparently accidentally snagged a couple sensitive spots, because of the couple times she yelled out and smacked me in the head. Eventually we managed to get the wound clean, packed it with fresh bandaging, and disinfected the whole bed, and finally she was ready for surgery. I had that smell trapped in my nose for a couple days afterwards. Just about all of us needed a few minutes to retch, and in some cases vomit a little after the whole ordeal. And then I got to go back to check in on my turd-throwing friend again. Application to med school now and bin. CNA worst things you experience are the people you're not allowed to euthanize. The people who live in agonizing hell for decades, where you feel like a torturer when you're holding them down to let the nurse stick her 30 centimeters suction tube down their throat. I felt bad when I had to help force this man to stay alive. I wish I could take every euthanasia critic to show him/her the suffering some people go through because we force them to live. Life just is effed up at times. Sometimes we're powerless and death is just the best option. Diarrhea blood fountain. Edit, because people asked for the story. I was a third-year med student on my 3-month internal medicine rotation. For people who don't know, this is generally the time in your life where you feel the most stupid every minute of every day. I had arrived for work just barely on time at 4:30 a.m. for my 5/7 3-hour shift. Of course I was dressed to the nines because medicine is stupid sometimes and you have to dress to impress. Tie, nice shoes, slacks, button up, that sorty thing. Might as well have had on tails and a top hat. Imagine a monocle for effect. I started rounding, of course. I went in to see Mr. Hippa. I had seen him for several days at this point and he was usually pretty chipper. He had been in the ICU for a GI bleed, but had done great and now stepped down to the floor. This morning he wasn't talking very much. That's not unusual though, it was 4:42 a.m. and I was barely conscious myself. But something felt off and there was just an odor in the room. My spider sense was tingling so I checked the bathroom. They always say you only have to smell Molina once to never forget. This was my once. The floor, the toilet, the walls, were covered in that inky black butt spray. I was assaulted by the pungent aroma of iron shavings and death. It was icky. So I went. Oh crap, Mr. Hippa. I'll be right back. I toddled off to find one of my residents. Those lazy bums didn't usually wander in until after 5. Managed to find my chief who seemed uninterested in what I had to say. I wasn't Chicken Little, I had never cried wolf before. I remember this seemed fairly important and him showing no interest whatsoever. Bad resident, no donut. So I went to the real power on the floor, the nurse's station. They promptly did the wrong thing too. They check his BP and systolic is in the low 80s. Prior had always hovered in the 130/40s. My internal dialogue is screaming. That boy ain't right. But my third-year medical student body is standing there, now surrounded by multiple nurses, just trying not to get in the way and trying not to look even more stupid or say the wrong thing. Well, they want to move him to the chair. I still, all these years later, have no idea why. I managed to squeak out should we be standing him up right now given the crazy low BP and massive blood loss? But an M.S.3. Speaking is like a fart in the wind, so I went unheard. So we stand him up. I'm holding onto his left arm, another nurse on his right. He had little strength to support himself. A half a gallon of blood-tinged crap, or crap-tinged blood? Promptly falls out of his butt onto the floor. I mean it literally fells. Imagine moving your china cabinet and it tilts a little bit and the dishes just fall. It didn't squirt, or spray. It just fell as a mass, hitting the floor and splashing out. At that point Mr. Hippa decides, enough with being conscious. And promptly passes the F out. It could have been something to do with, he now had a HGB around 3 and went from laying to standing with a BP on the lower end of life compatibility. Now, I'm a regular-sized big guy, 6 feet, 200 pounds. My nurse was 5'3", 120 pounds. Mr. Hippa was 6'3", 250 pounds. There was no stopping this fall once it began. Timber. He fell face forward and planted right into his bed. Crisis averted. My moment of joy was instantly changed to terror as I looked down at his bare butthole, jackknifed into the air like a Whataburger A-frame. Then it happened. Diarrhea blood fountain. The perfect symmetry of it as it exploded from his butt is something I'll never forget. It was like the Bellagio, or Buckingham Fountain in Chicago. Just this perfect fluid dynamic cone that reached 1.5 feet into the air, then gently allowed gravity to pull it down, making that gorgeous trumpet-like flare. Except it was made of diarrhea and blood. Before I could think, suddenly Spy Break by the Propeller Heads was playing. For those not in the know, that was the song that played in the lobby scene in The Matrix. I, in my tie and fancy clothes, was Neo. My concrete pillars were the various nurses. They took hit after hit, while I dodged like Christian Bale in Equilibrium. I danced, I juked, I spun like no one has ever spun before. I was the Fred Astaire of crap swerving. When it was all said and done, 3 nurses lost their lives that day, meaning were covered in crap, while I, who had been staring down that fleshy barrel, had gotten away without one speck of red or brown or black on me. The outcome. Mr. Hippa went back to the ICU, little bit of PRBC, another embolization, and he was home happy and healthy 2 weeks later. I got in trouble for not letting my resident know what was going on. What? And as far as I'm aware, those nurses are still showering to this day. I was an operating room nurse and I assisted a hemipelvectomy after a large vehicle crushed a patient's whole left hip. The connections were severed, His bladder was in tatters and the whole left leg had died, so it had to be amputated from the hip. I held the leg the whole time. Worst part is that it was a 9-year-old boy. Not me but my wife, had a toddler about 2 to 3 years old come in with severe burning to the lower half of his body. Like, the way she described it was, his skin was bubbly and peeling. Turned out his aunt had been babysitting him and became angry when the kid spilled his drink on himself. So she ran a scalding hot bath and basically dipped the poor child in and left him. The person in the next apartment heard screaming, so called the cops. People refusing medicine for their children. I get if it's you, because it's your decision. If it's a child, then you are putting someone else's life at risk. I have no problem with people using essential oils, if they actually get proper treatment. Some kid had a cut on his foot and his parents put vodka on it, which causes harm to healthy tissue and can harm more than it helps. Kid got an infection and almost lost his foot.